Chapter 33, From the Age of Limits to the Age of Reagan. Politics and Diplomacy After Watergate. Gerald Ford, who is now the president, pardons Nixon for Watergate to avoid years of investigation. And, well, some people suspect a deal between the two men, but then none of that was true. There were economic problems. He attempted to solve them by voluntary efforts, cutting federal spending. However, these did not work, and there's the continuing energy crisis. Foreign policy was like Nixon, and there was the basis for the SALT II, which was the Arms Limitation Treaty with Russia, and better relations with China. In 1976, we have Republican Gerald Ford versus Democrat Jimmy Carter, and because there's disenchantment with Ford and economic problems, we have a narrow victory for Carter. However, Carter's lack of a direction and vision for government, he raised spending, he cut taxes, soaring inflation due to OPEC price increases. Carter made a crisis of confidence, aka malaise speech, and it appeared to America that it sounded like he was blaming his problems on the American people. However, Carter's greatest achievement was the Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty, which was the Camp David Accords. SALT II is finished. It limited long-range missiles, bombers, nuclear warheads for the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Americans support the Shah of Iran, and the Iranians revolt, and the Shah flees. So the power in Iran is in the religious leader Ayatollah Khamenei. An armed mob seizes the American embassy and holds hostages until the Shah is returned. The Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, and the U.S. response is only to withdraw from the Olympics and SALT II. Because of the economic troubles and the international crises equals anxiety and Carter's already low public standing. The rise of the new American right. We have the rise of the Sun Belt, which is essentially the South, the Southwest, and California. Population growth, shift in economic focus, and a change in politics. We have opposition to government growth and regulations of the liberal state. We have the Sagebrush Rebellion in the West, in which there is conservative opposition to laws and restrictions on development. We have conservative suburbs. We flee our problems and the diversity of cities. Other parts of the nation abandon the values and norms of society. Religious revivalism with evangelical Christianity. In the middle class in larger numbers than in the past rural Christians. With politics, there was a fearing spread of morality and the threat of feminism on traditional marriage. There was an elimination of religious observance from schools and the allowance of abortion. So the moral majority in the Christian coalition attacked secular humanism, which is America's rejection of religion, and want Christian values to dominate American life. There are better organized and funded conservative campaigns now, and right-wing leadership is under Ronald Reagan, who advocates individual freedom and free enterprise. There's a rise of the right after Goldwater's defeat and the moderate policies of Gerald Ford. The Tax Revolt with Proposition 13 was a referendum ballot about lowering tax rates in California, and anti-tax movements spread. There are attacks on specific programs, but these are futile. With the attack on taxes, there is more support for the conservative right. In 1980, we have Democrat Carter versus Republican Reagan. Reagan criticizes government excess promised tax cuts, wanted a restoration of American strength and pride. And he won the election with 489 electoral votes and 51% popular vote. The American hostages in Iran are freed when Iranian assets are released from American banks, and it was actually on the day of Reagan's inauguration. The Reagan Revolution. There was victory with Reagan due to the illusionment with Carter and the conservative coalition. The corporate elite were hostile to the government interference and the commitment to capitalism and unlimited economic growth. And then there were the neoconservatives, which were former liberals who realized the danger of radicalism and wanted to win back the culture. And then there were populist conservatives who had opposition to centralized power and influence and threats to freedom. Reagan was in reality the oldest president, but he had this image of youth, and he surrounded himself with other administrators. He didn't consider him the smartest in the room. He used TV more effectively to gain more support. We had supply-side economics, which was to cut taxes to encourage investment and cut the federal budget. We had deregulation, a decrease in government interference. There was a recession and then economic revival due to the tight money policies. With the fiscal crisis, we have increasing deficits and debt. There was increase in entitlement programs and military spending. The decrease in domestic spending that accompanied that was not enough to make up for the difference. Reagan said that America should oppose communism and support friendly governments. The Strategic Defense Initiative, or known as SDI or even Star Wars, Reagan claimed that it could provide a shield against missiles and make nuclear war obsolete. The Soviets said this elevated the arms race and that there were movements in the U.S. for a nuclear freeze. The Reagan Doctrine says support opponents of communism anywhere, and there is new American activism in the Third World. So we are helping in Contras in Nicaragua against the Sandinista government. And the American forces in Lebanon suffer a terrorist bombing in which Marines are killed and troops are withdrawn. And from this we learn that it is difficult to fight terrorism. With the election of 1984, we have Republican Reagan versus Democratic Walter Mondale, who had a woman as a running mate. But we have a decisive victory for Reagan with his, quote, "It's morning in America. We have a new future. We can recover from the crises of the 70s. America and the waning of the Cold War. In 1985, we have Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who changed policies in the Soviet Union dramatically. He instituted glasnost, which was openness, dismantling repression, and perestroika, which was reform, restructuring the economy with capitalism. He drastically reduced the Soviet Union's influence in the world, and Eastern Europe starts having non-communist governments. There is a movement for democratization in China. However, they are crushed in a massacre at Tiananmen Square. There's an unraveling of communist power in the Soviet Union. Republics declare independence, and the powerless Communist Party in the Soviet Union ceases to exist. Reagan and Gorbachev eliminate the U.S. and the Soviet Union nuclear forces from Europe. And with the savings and loan crisis, we have the deregulation of savings and loan industry. And there's the reckless and corrupt expansion of banks, and the government has to step in to prevent their collapse. Then we have the Iran-Contra scandal, in which money from an Iran arms deal was illegally sent to help Contras in Nicaragua. These covert activities were to advance foreign policy. It was secret and illegal. However, The allegations were never able to tie directly to Reagan. In 1988, we have Republican George Bush versus Democrat Mikhail Dukakis. Bush's negative, effective campaign against Dukakis allows him to be victorious. However, there is still a Democratic majority in the Congress. There are measures to ward arm reductions agreements with Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. However, Bush has conflicting goals. We need to reduce the deficit and have no new taxes, but the Democratic Congress has other ideas. The budget package, including a tax increase to reduce deficit, led to a recession in 1990, and there was huge amounts of debt and bankruptcies. At this point, America is the only real superpower in the world because of the defeat of the fall of the Soviet Union, and it uses its power for regional and economic interests. When Iraq invades oil-rich Kuwait, Bush gets many other countries to place a trade embargo on Iraq. And then the U.S. and the Allies have a military force in Kuwait on the Saudi Arabian border, and they promised military action to expel Iraq if they did not get out of Kuwait, because they wanted the oil in Kuwait. They didn't want Iraq taking over. And so they had an Allied bombing of Iraq in Kuwait and a ground offensive in Iraq. También. Spanish. Okay, never mind. There was almost no resistance to these attacks, and so there was a ceasefire, and this war, known as the Persian Gulf War, ends. In the election of 1992, we have Bush, who has no policies for combating the recession. So then we have Democratic candidate Bill Clinton. But then we have an independent candidate, Ross Perot, who promised to deal with the fiscal crisis and other problems. In this election, nobody technically wins, but Ross Perot splits the Republican vote with Bush, and thus giving Clinton the presidency, even with only 43% of the vote. And that brings us up almost to modern day. Adios.